Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. May you live in interesting times. That runs an ancient Chinese curse. Now, my guest today, Adel Iskandar, he's an Arab studies scholar at Georgetown University in the U.S. He might well argue that Egypt's 7,000-year history, which has been full of confrontation and clashes, has been a never-ending series of interesting times. But few Egyptians have ever witnessed anything more interesting, perhaps, than the popular uprising that toppled longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak back in 2011 and ushered in a revolutionary new era, an era that's more than ever a work in progress. How it will all end, if it ends, is anyone's guess. As Iskandar makes clear in his new book, it's Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution. It spans nearly 3 tumultuous years, from August 2010 to April 2013. It looks at the revolution from a vast range of perspectives, right from the football pitch to the International Monetary Fund. Adel Iskandar, you're joining me from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me.
You chose, as my viewers just heard, you chose these 3 years. They end in April 2013, earlier this year, shortly before Mohamed Morsi was toppled by the military. You seemed, however, to sort of see the writing on the wall for him. You said that perhaps it almost seems like the army had it planned all along. You didn't say that, but it's almost as if you saw that.
Well, I mean, there was no crystal ball. There was no prophetic, capability here. It was just fairly clear that there was sort of it appeared to be a strange constellation of forces that had come together to make Morsi's demise almost inevitable. On one level, you had a military establishment that had, for the past 2 years, or the 2 years since the removal of Hosni Mubarak, tried to essentially shed the facade of being implicit and complicit as well in supporting the former NDP regime and becoming more revolutionary, or appearing to have the facade of revolution. And alternatively, you had the Muslim Brotherhood in a very sort of jarring moment in contemporary Egyptian history try to capitalize on their electoral gains by consolidating power and pushing forth a fairly divisive political situation. So it was fairly obvious that a collision course was on its way, even though when it came down to it, from a legislative and a judicial standpoint, and even from an executive political standpoint, it looked like the military and the Muslim Brotherhood had signed a pact that could take them, well into the years, for years to come.
And that was the hope, at least in the beginning. But like you said, now the Muslim Brotherhood, they'd been out of power essentially for 80 years, often oppressed, rounded up, sometimes thrown into prison. Suddenly they find themselves in power. Do you think, it seems that you're arguing sometimes, the Muslim Brotherhood, that Morsi himself was too closely associated with the Muslim Brotherhood to be a pragmatic voice for a modern democratic Egypt?
Yes. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it was clear from day one. I mean, this was an individual who, while indebted to a large number of people and political forces that, were able to bring him to power, namely the young revolutionaries that supported him at the expense of the former regime candidate of the military, Ahmed Shafiq, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces that was able to architecturally build a political system that allowed the Brotherhood to compete on an even playing field. So really he was indebted to everyone, but the greatest debt was to the Muslim Brotherhood, where he was reared and bred politically, and he was brought practically out of anonymity to the forefront to represent the organization. So he was most beholden and most shackled by the Muslim Brotherhood through both allegiance and really sort of pragmatic loyalty. And that, I think, was his Achilles heel from day one. So the article that I wrote on Morsi's debts was published, I think, a week and a half after his election, in an attempt to predict what might happen.
His allegiances are what brought him down.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, Morsi did have an opportunity to be a uniter. He ran on a campaign of union and steadfastness and plurality. I mean, he promised to to immediately appoint in a presidential decree a woman vice president, a Coptic vice president. I mean, these are all fairly easy things to do. I mean, at least on a tokenistic level. But instead, he continued to speak more to his own constituency and alienated a substantial proportion of the population. So I think that speaks to the constituency and the institution that mattered most to Mohammed Morsi, which is really the Brotherhood.
The Brotherhood. And now look at today. You're speaking obviously in the past tense. Morsi is now a has-been, was. Few people predict he'll come back to power. What about the young revolutionaries that originally brought down Mubarak, the early days of the revolution? A lot of them, at least early on, supported this military ouster, if you want to call it that. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Yes, I mean it's important to really understand revolutionary fervor more, in ways that go beyond the headlines. There's a lot of mythology and a lot of sort of fiction around what this revolution was. That it was young secular youth that were of the upper middle class and they represent the intelligentsia. The revolution in Egypt was far more complicated and far more nuanced. And there is a fairly strong argument to say that perhaps the majority of the Egyptian population were not necessarily in support of the revolution. So the argument that I've made throughout the book is that Egyptian politics is, similar to what Baudrillard would describe as a simulacra, that it is sort of a fictionalized mirror of a miniaturized ideal situation.
We've created
it really
a narrative.
Has never been. Exactly. We've created a narrative, and this narrative is constantly shifting. So what does a revolution mean today versus what it meant 3 years ago? Today, everybody in Egypt feels like they're a revolutionary. If you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, you feel like you've been wronged, even though you missed the first few days of the January 25th revolution. Today, you feel like you are squarely standing up against the military and doing so alone, so you feel like a revolutionary. The young revolutionaries are disenchanted. Even the Mubarak supporters today, those who were opposed to the revolution from day one, feel that they were actively participated in the ouster of Mohammed Morsi, and that gives them, or they believe that gives them revolutionary legitimacy. So today Egypt is full of revolutionaries, but really, what does it mean to be a revolutionary in the sense
it's
of the
interesting, this whole idea of everyone being a revolutionary in society. With you, I think you describe it at one point in your book. You use the term Anarchosyndicalist, and you say there's something in Egypt. You describe it as an Anarchosyndicalist society, and I read that and I thought there's something in its DNA, perhaps. Is there something in the Egyptian culture that's hardwired to every few years or every few decades to come to these life or death standoffs?
I generally have an aversion to anything that implies that there's a genetic sort of underpinning to.
I don't mean
culture.
it literally. I mean a cultural predisposition.
I know what you mean. Yes, so I don't think it's necessarily culture. I think it's essentially the product of a political circumstance over the past 60 years, and perhaps even longer, perhaps as far as 7,000 years, where you've got tyrannical authoritarianism that slowly sort of its ability to control the public and control the narrative and the control of the public's imaginary slowly dissipates. So that leaves room for very sort of unofficial ways to do things. The Mubarak government, for instance, in its sort of aggressive attempt to enshrine the IMF policies, for instance, ended up alienating a significant proportion of the population. It was very limited trickle down, and the Egyptian government could no longer continue to be a nation that subsidizes its own people. So what happens in these unofficial spaces? That's where I think revolutions really begin and real sort of sovereignty is found. So Egypt is really now completely ungovernable, even though it appears as though the military is in control. It is a self. I mean, it's a
little bit of
constellation
anarchy
of
out there right
self-governing
now.
Territories. Yes, but I don't mean it in the chaotic sense. Egypt is really quite orderly, given the absence of real sort of institutional power on a daily basis.
Let me just jump in there for a second. Right now, you essentially do have a military calling the shots and control.
Yes.
And you make the point that perhaps what the political culture needs is what you'd call secular criticism. You need to have some way of disentwining, if I can use that word, religion and politics. Is that possible?
I think it's. This is a borrowed term from the late Palestinian American scholar Edward Said, and the argument is essentially focused on basically distancing ourselves from dogmas. I mean, various dogmas, whether they're theological dogmas like the importance of enshrining, let's say, Sharia law, or determining people's worth or how they stand in relation to the state based on their creed or based on their perspectives, based on their attitude. empire. These are all dogmas. And then there's also another kind of dogma that goes beyond the typical notion of secularity, which is the dogma of nationalism, ultranationalism, which is what the military is taking advantage of today. So when I say secular criticism, it is a critique of all forms of radical dogmas, whether they are in the face of in the form of militarized nationalism or sort of theocratic exceptionalism.
Briefly, Adel Iskandar, very little time left. Big topic, but right now you have a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The top leaders have been arrested, some in jail, many now about to face trial. Is this just vengeance? No matter how you look at it, no matter what you think of the Muslim Brothers, is it just vengeance by the military out to get them?
No, it's not. It's not just vengeance. Again, I think it is basically it's a product of a failure on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood to produce a rhetoric that resonates with the public. Keep in mind that the majority of the Egyptian population is cheerleading this witch hunt against the Brotherhood. If they were able to produce a discourse that's more convincing in this battle for the illusion and the imaginary, they would find themselves on the other side of the table. Unfortunately, they are the victims of their own mistakes, as well as the military's sort of power-hungry opportunism and the public's sort of kind-hearted acceptance of what the military is putting forth.
Adel Iskandar, we're going to have to leave it there. I thank you very much. Arab Studies scholar, now teaching at Georgetown University in the United States. We've been talking about the current situation in Egyptian society, as well as your new book, Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.